David Calder stood on the porch of his ranch house with a letter in his hand that he had already read 11 times, though the words had not changed since the first reading. 10 years. He had carried that word in his head so long it had worn a groove there, the way water wears a groove into stone, patient and constant and impossible to stop. The letter said only that the afternoon train from Helena would reach the depot at Larkspur Hollow on Tuesday, and that she hoped, if he was willing, he might be there to meet it. It was signed Josephine Hale, not Josie, which struck him as strange until he remembered that 10 years was long enough for a girl's name to grow up alongside the girl herself. He set the letter on the porch rail and looked out at the land he had spent 30 years building, the fences mended 100 times over, the barn he had raised with his own hands, and the hands of men now gone or moved on. None of it had meant as much to him, not one board of it, as the sound of a young woman's voice on this same porch telling him she loved him, and his own voice, cracked and certain and wrong, telling her she was 20 years too young for him to have that. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. It had happened on an evening in late summer, 10 years before the letter came. Josie Hale had grown up on Calder land the way a fence post grows into a fence line, so gradual you forget it was ever planted there at all. Her father, Tom Hale, had been David's foreman for 11 years before a horse threw him in a hailstorm and broke his neck on the rocks by the creek. Josie's mother had died bringing her into the world, so when Tom went into the ground beside his wife, there was no one left to take the girl but David, who had known her since she was small enough to ride in the crook of his arm while he checked fence line. He gave her a room in the house, paid for her schooling in town, and by the time she was 24 she had taken over his ledgers, and his correspondence and half the running of the household besides, because she had a mind for numbers and a patience for detail that David, if he was honest with himself, had never possessed. She had buried her father herself, dry-eyed, in the small plot behind the church, and had gone back to the ranch house that same evening and set the supper table for two without being asked, because grief, in Josie Hale's way of doing things, was a private matter and the work of a household did not stop to wait on it. David had watched her do that, a girl of 17 laying out plates with steady hands, while her whole world had come apart that morning, and had thought even then that there was more iron in her than in most men he had hired in his life. She was standing on this same porch, in this same evening light, when she told him. She did not wring her hands over it or dress it up in girlish softness. She set down the account book she had been carrying, looked at him steady, and said she loved him, and had loved him for longer than she cared to admit, and that she was not a child anymore, whatever he might tell himself to make the saying of it easier. David remembered every word of his answer because he had regretted most of it within the hour. He told her she was 20 years too young for him. He told her that a man his age had no business courting a girl who had grown up calling him nothing warmer than Mr. Calder. He told her, and this was the part he regretted longest, that she deserved a husband who could grow old beside her instead of one who was already halfway there. Josie did not cry, and she did not argue with him, which was somehow worse than either. She picked the ledger back up off the porch rail, held it against her chest like a shield, and said that she had not asked him to marry her today. She said she was telling him, plain, that she intended to marry him in 10 years, and that he was welcome to spend the time deciding whether he meant to make her wait for nothing or not. Then she said the 6 words that David Calder had turned over in his mind every single day since. Then wait 10 years, David Calder. She left for Helena within the month, to train as a schoolteacher at the normal college there, and the ranch house had felt, from that evening forward, like a room with the furniture taken out of it. The 10 years that followed were not, David would have told you, especially eventful ones, at least not on the surface of things. The ranch grew. He bought out the Whitfield spread to the north, when old man Whitfield died without an heir willing to work it, and the Calder herd nearly doubled in size. He hired more hands, built a second bunkhouse, put in a proper well so the household no longer hauled water from the creek. Larkspur Hollow itself grew up around him, a proper depot going in, where there had only been a flag stop, a schoolhouse and a church and a mercantile that finally stocked more than flour and nails. He put in irrigation ditches that turned 200 acres of scrub into hayground, and the winter losses that had plagued the herd in his father's day became, under his management, a rare enough event that neighboring ranchers started riding out to ask his advice on wintering stock. By any measure a man might use, David Calder prospered in those 10 years, and prospered visibly, in a county where visible prosperity was noticed and discussed at every church, social, and cattle auction for 100 miles. He also, in 10 years, did not court a single woman, though there was no shortage of women in the county willing to be courted by a man who owned that much land. She came home only once in those 10 years, in the third winter, when the roads were bad enough that she nearly did not make it at all. It was Christmas, and she stayed 4 days, sleeping in her old room and taking her meals with the household same as always. And the two of them were careful with each other, the entire visit, in a way that told anyone watching exactly how much effort the carefulness cost. They did not speak of the porch or the promise. They spoke of the herd count and the new well and a book she had been teaching her students. And on the third evening, when Ruth Cobbler had gone up to bed and the fire had burned low, Josie asked him, plain as anything, whether he had changed his mind. David told her he had not, and she nodded once, like a woman confirming a fact she had already suspected, and the next morning she caught the early stage back to the rail line without either of them saying much more about it. She did not come home again until the letter arrived 10 years later, and David understood, without her ever having to explain it to him, that she had stayed away on purpose, because a promise tested too often by nearness was a promise more likely to break. Mrs. Adeline Pruitt, widowed twice over and possessed of a fine house in town, made her interest plain enough that half the county knew of it before David did. He turned her down over coffee one afternoon, gently and without much explanation, and when she pressed him for a reason he only said that he was waiting on someone, and left it there. The saying of it traveled through Larkspur Hollow inside of a week, the way anything worth gossiping about always did, and by the time it had passed through the mercantile and the church social and the barber shop it had grown into a dozen different rumors, none of them true and one of them, by pure accident, close enough. Folks began to notice that David Calder never mentioned the Hale girl without a particular carefulness in how he said her name, and that he still paid, every year without fail, the fee for her subscription to the Helena paper, though nobody could recall him ever admitting to it directly. His housekeeper, a stout, plain-spoken woman named Ruth Cobbler, who had run his kitchen for 15 years, was the only one in the household who dared to say anything to his face about it. She would set his coffee down of a morning and remark, apropos of nothing, that a man could waste an awful lot of good years standing at a fence he'd built himself. David generally answered her with silence, which Ruth had long since learned to interpret as agreement he wasn't ready to speak aloud. Once, on his 49th birthday, she asked him outright whether he intended to spend the whole of his life waiting on a girl who might never come back at all. He told her that Josie Hale had never broken a promise to him in the whole of her life, not once, not even a small one, and he did not intend to be the reason the streak ended. Ruth had laughed at that, not unkindly, and told him that a man could build a very lonely kind of faithfulness out of waiting on a woman who had not asked him to wait quite so hard as he seemed determined to. David had not argued the point. He had simply gone back out to check the fence line, the same fence line he had been checking, by Ruth's private count, considerably more often than the fence required. Josie's years in Helena were, by her own account in the rare letters she sent, quieter than his, though no less full. She finished her course at the normal college in 2 years, instead of the usual 3, on account of applying herself with a single-mindedness her instructors remarked on more than once. She taught for a season in a one-room schoolhouse outside the city, before a position opened at a larger academy, and within 4 years she was made assistant headmistress, and within 7, headmistress outright, the youngest the school had ever appointed. It was during that 7th year that a fire broke out in the academy's coal store on a bitter January night, and it was Josie, roused from her rooms above the schoolhouse by the smell of smoke, who walked the length of every hallway herself, calm as a woman checking her own kitchen, and got 11 boarding students out through a side door, before the volunteer company had even finished hitching their wagon. The Helena paper ran a small notice about it the following week, calling her a credit to the institution, and Josie, who had never been one to make much of herself, cut the notice out only because one of her students asked to keep it, and mailed it along to nobody at all, though she thought more than once about tucking a copy into her next letter to Larkspur Hollow before deciding against it. She had not built the last 7 years of her life to be admired for them. She had built them so that when she finally did go home, she would know, in her own bones and not merely in David's estimation of her, that she was a woman capable of holding a room steady when it mattered. She wrote to David perhaps 4 times a year, and her letters were careful things, full of ledgers and enrollment numbers, and the occasional dry observation about a difficult school board member, and empty, deliberately and entirely, of anything that might be mistaken for longing. She had meant what she said on the porch. She was not going to spend 10 years as a girl pining after a man 20 years her senior. She meant to become, in that decade, a woman fully capable of standing beside him as an equal, not a woman who had simply waited in a doorway for a life to be handed to her. There were men in Helena who courted her, 3 of them across the years by her own later telling, decent men with steady prospects, and she turned each of them down with the same plain honesty she had used on David's porch that summer evening. She did not tell any of them why. She had made a promise, and whatever else people might say about Josie Hale, in Larkspur Hollow or in Helena both, nobody who knew her would ever have said she was a woman who broke her word. She kept a small tin box on her dresser those 10 years, and inside it, she kept every one of David's short, careful letters. The ones where he wrote about the weather and the herd count and never once about anything a person might call feeling, and she read them again on the evenings when the waiting felt long. Because even a letter about fence posts was, if you looked at it a certain way, a man telling a woman he had not forgotten her. It was in the 10th year, in the same month the promise had been made, that Josie sat down at the small desk in her rooms above the academy and wrote the letter that would reach David Calder's porch on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. She did not fill it with declarations. She simply told him the date of the train and asked, if he was willing, that he meet it. She sealed the envelope and sat with it a long while before walking it to the post office herself. Because 10 years is a long time to hold a promise, and a person does not send a letter that ends the waiting without first sitting a moment in the last quiet of it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. David rode into Larkspur Hollow 2 hours before the train was due, which was, Ruth Cobbler told him plainly before he left the house, at least an hour and a half more than any sensible man required. He tied his horse outside the depot and stood on the platform in a coat he had not worn since a funeral 3 years prior, turning his hat in his hands the way he had not done since he was young enough not to know better. The depot master, who had seen a great many reunions on that platform over the years, recognized something in the set of David Calder's shoulders that told him this particular one mattered more than most, and had the decency not to say so. Instead, he offered David a cup of coffee from the pot he kept warm in the office, and David drank it standing, watching the empty stretch of track running north toward the pass, thinking of 100 things he might say, and discarding every one of them as either too much or not nearly enough. A wind came up off the foothills and set the depot flag snapping, and somewhere down the platform, a boy was selling apples out of a barrow, calling his price in a voice that cracked between a child's pitch and a man's. And David thought, absurdly, of how much the whole world kept right on changing while a person stood still waiting for one particular thing to arrive. The train came in on time, which David would later say was the only thing that whole day that happened exactly the way he expected it to. Steam rolled back along the platform, and passengers began to step down, a drummer with a case of samples, a family of 4 still dusty from the road, an old woman being helped down by the conductor. And then Josie Hale stepped onto the platform of Larkspur Hollow for the first time in 10 years, and David Calder, who had built up in his mind 100 different pictures of what this moment might look like, found that none of them had prepared him for the plain, quiet fact of her. She was 34 now, and it showed in the way she carried herself, rather than in any single feature he could have named. A steadiness that had not been there at 24, a certainty in how she set her feet and held her chin that came only from having spent 10 years answering to no one but herself. She wore a traveling dress of good, sensible wool, dark green, with a satchel of books over one shoulder that she had clearly refused to check with her trunk. Her hair was pinned up under a plain hat in a style David did not recognize. City fashion, he supposed, and there were a few lines at the corners of her eyes that had not been there before. The kind that come from squinting at student essays by lamplight, rather than from any unhappiness. There was a small brooch at her collar he did not recognize, silver, shaped like a schoolhouse bell, and he would learn later that her students had given it to her the day she was named headmistress, and that she wore it, she told him, on any occasion she considered worth marking. She was David thought, standing there with his hat forgotten in his hands. The most composed person he had ever seen step off a train, and he found himself grateful, in that first unsteady moment, that 10 years had given him at least the good sense not to say so out loud, before she had a chance to speak first. She found him in the crowd the way a person finds the one thing in a room they came looking for, without any visible searching at all, and she crossed the platform to him with her satchel still over her shoulder, and stopped an arm's length away, close enough to speak without raising her voice, and far enough that neither of them had to decide yet what closer might mean. "Mr. Calder," she said, and there was the faintest edge of humor in it, because they both knew by now that Mr. Calder had stopped being the whole truth of what she called him a long time ago. David found his voice took a moment to arrive. "Miss Hale," he said back, matching her, because two people who have waited 10 years to say something plain do not generally rush the plain saying of it. "You look well." "I am well," she said. "I have been headmistress of a school for 3 years now. I have my own house, paid for with my own wages, and I have turned down 3 perfectly reasonable men who wanted to marry me, for reasons I expect you can guess at." David looked at her a long moment, the platform noise going on around them, a porter calling for a cart, a child somewhere crying for its mother. "I said some things to you on that porch I have spent 10 years wishing I could take back," he said. "Not the waiting. I don't regret asking you to wait, because I believe now it was the only honest thing to do with a girl of 24 who thought she knew her own mind better than I trusted her to. But I said it unkindly, and I have carried that. You said I was 20 years too young for you," Josie said. "It was true. It is still true, David. The arithmetic has not changed a single day in 10 years. "No," David said. "It hasn't. I kept the letters," David added, before she could answer. "Every one you sent me. I kept them in the desk drawer in the front room, and I read them more than a sensible man would admit to, hunting for something in them you never once put there on purpose, I expect, because you were being careful the same way I was trying to be. I want you to know that. Whatever else you came here today to say to me, I want you to know I did not spend 10 years forgetting you existed." "I never thought you had," Josie said, and something in her voice loosened slightly, the first real softness he had heard in it since the platform. "I have a tin box on my dresser in Helena, with every letter you ever sent me in it too, David. I could recite you the herd counts from 3 winters running if you asked me to. I did not keep them, because I cared about the herd counts." Josie shifted the satchel on her shoulder, the first uncertain motion he had seen from her since she stepped off the train. "But I am not 24 anymore," she said, and her voice had gone quieter, though it did not shake. "I am 34, and you are 54, and 20 years does not sit the same on a woman of 34 as it does on a girl of 24, and we both know it, whatever the numbers say. I did not come back today, because I am still the girl who stood on your porch and told you she loved you before she'd had the chance to become anybody yet. I came back because I spent 10 years becoming somebody, on purpose, so that when I stood in front of you again there would be no question left for you to raise. I have my own house. I have my own income. I do not need rescuing, David Calder, and I never did, not even then, though I understand better now why you thought I did." David set his hat back on his head, slow, the way a man does when he has finally decided on something after a long while of turning it over. Then he did a thing that surprised even the depot master, who had by now given up all pretense of not watching. He reached out and took the satchel of books from her shoulder himself, the way a man carries a thing for someone he intends to be carrying things for a good while yet. And he said, plain as she had ever said anything to him, that he had not spent the last 10 years waiting to see whether she would come back so that he could tell her no a second time. "Then what did you spend them waiting for?" Josie asked him, though David thought she likely already knew the answer and simply wanted to hear him say it out loud, the way she had made him say true things out loud once before on a porch a decade past. "I spent them," David said, "waiting to be a man who deserved the answer you gave me. You told me to wait 10 years. I did not spend those years standing still, Josie. I built this county up around Larkspur Hollow near twice the size it was, and I turned down every woman in it who offered me an easier road than the one I'd chosen. And I read every letter you sent me a dozen times over hunting for something warmer than fence counts and enrollment figures. And I kept every last one of them in the drawer of my desk, because a man does not throw away the only thing a woman has agreed to give him. I am 54 years old, and I am not going to pretend that isn't true, or that it won't matter more with every year that passes. But I would rather have whatever years I've got left with you in them than a longer stretch of years with anyone else in your place." Josie did not answer him right away. She looked at him a long moment on that platform, the steam from the engine drifting past them both, and something in her face, the careful composure she had carried off that train, finally gave way to something plainer and less guarded. The same look David remembered from a girl of 24 standing her ground on a porch rail with a ledger held against her chest like armor. Then she reached out, took his free hand in both of hers, and said that she supposed, all things considered, 10 years had been exactly long enough. Word of it moved through Larkspur Hollow faster than the train itself had, the way word of anything worth telling always did in a town that small. By the time David and Josie had walked the length of the platform toward his waiting horse, half the mercantile had already heard that the Hale girl was back, and that David Calder had met her at the depot himself in his good coat. And by supper the whole town had settled the matter for themselves the way small towns do, deciding a thing was true before anyone directly involved had said so out loud. Mrs. Pruitt, when she heard it over her own supper table, was heard to remark only that she supposed some fences really were built to be waited at, which Ruth Cobbler later repeated to David with no small satisfaction, having predicted as much herself years before. Even the depot master claimed a share of the credit, telling anyone at the mercantile who would listen that he had known something was different the moment David Calder showed up 2 hours early in his good coat, and that a man did not do that for just anybody. They were married that same autumn, in the little church that had gone up in Larkspur Hollow sometime during the years Josie had been away, with Ruth Cobbler crying openly in the second pew, and the depot master, who felt he had earned a place at the wedding on account of having witnessed the whole reunion firsthand, standing near the back in his good hat. Josie kept her position at the academy in Helena a while longer, traveling back on the very train that had first carried her home, until a school opened in Larkspur Hollow itself the following spring, and she took it over as its first headmistress, on the sound theory that a town growing as fast as this one needed a proper schoolhouse of its own, and that she was, by every measure that mattered, exactly the woman to build one. She hired her own teachers, ordered her own books from a catalog in Chicago, and by that first autumn had 40 children walking up the schoolhouse steps every morning, several of them the sons and daughters of ranch hands David had known his whole life. And there was something in watching her stand on those steps in the early light, greeting each child by name, that struck David as a finer thing than anything he had built with fence posts and cattle in 30 years of trying. Ruth Cobbler stayed on in the household even after the wedding, on the grounds, she said, that somebody sensible needed to keep an eye on the two of them, and she took a particular satisfaction in reminding David, whenever the opportunity arose, that she had told him so, though she was never entirely specific about which of her many predictions she meant. Mrs. Pruitt sent a wedding gift, a set of good china, with a note wishing them well that David thought was more gracious than he had any right to expect, and Josie wrote her a thank you letter by return post that began a friendship neither of them had anticipated. David Calder stood on his porch again that winter, the same porch where a girl of 24 had once told him a truth he was not ready to hear, and watched his wife grade a stack of student compositions by lamplight at the very desk where he had once kept her letters in a drawer. She looked up at him after a while, the way she had a habit of doing when she felt him watching, and asked what he was thinking about, standing there so quiet. "I was thinking," David said, "that you were right about the arithmetic. 20 years is 20 years. It never did stop being true." "No," Josie agreed, setting her pen down. "But I notice you're not standing over there anymore, telling me it's a problem." David crossed the porch and sat down beside her, close enough now that there was no arm's length left between them at all, and said that some kinds of waiting, once they were finally over, had a way of making a man forget he'd ever thought the years were the thing that mattered. Josie set her stack of compositions aside and leaned into him, and for a while neither of them said anything more, the lamp burning steady on the desk, and the winter wind working at the corners of the house the way it always did that time of year. Somewhere out past the barn a horse stamped once in the cold, and the sound of it carried across the yard and faded, and David thought that he had spent 30 years building a ranch out of fence posts and patience, and had not understood until this exact winter evening that the thing he had actually been building, the whole while, was a porch a woman would one day be glad to come home to. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.